I want to focus on element of Trump's campaigning, which is basically really been a key way in which he's built his base, which is to run incredibly racist, misogynistic, bigoted election campaigns. And I'm just going to show now an infamous clip that made waves just before the election. So just going to share a clip now.
Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
So, this rhetoric from a so-called comedian is really quite characteristic of Trump's campaign and messaging, but it goes really quite far beyond rhetoric. We've got historic attacks taking place right now on a woman's right to choose on abortion, threats of mass deportations, and a growing climate in the US of repression and censorship. So, Sequoyah, I wanted to bring you in if you could talk a little bit about the war on woke, that we are seeing the surge of the far right globally and the new age of McCarthyism. Like, what does Trump's victory mean for the struggle against the far right internationally?
Thanks a lot for that intro. Before touching on Trump and that current of right wing, what you can describe as neo-fascism, I think in order to do justice to that question, we have to place it into the context of the USA. And perhaps we can first travel across the globe over to South Korea, in fact. And there's a particular quote from 81-year-old Du Guillaume, who was arrested for protesting a US missile system placed in her village. And she proudly proclaimed, in response to being arrested, "I hate all US presidents." Now, I'm sure millions around the world nodded in agreement, and it's got some notoriety, that quote now. But for many people, whether Trump or Harris won, the oligarchy won. So although, and we'll come to that, there are differences, I think it's important to place this into context. And there were reports today, of course, of Trump's victory adding a record $64 billion to wealth of the richest top 10, including Elon Musk, of course, as well as Bezos and Bill Gates. The choice at any US election, unfortunately, and this sort of builds on what Matthew was referring to, really, that the realistic and practical choice is US capitalism and human suffering with or without decorum. And there is obviously huge work to change that from a third party perspective, but there are significant structural barriers around lobbying and the media and such like. But just a quick reminder, some may be familiar with it, but there was a 2014 study that described the US as an oligarchy in that voters effectively have no say in policy. And some regard that as a sort of epitaph where you can change the government, but not the policy. And to sort of build on that, many people argue that the US is effectively a fascist entity by definition. It was born of indigenous genocide and slavery, whether liberal or conservative, certain groups will be oppressed. And in this sense, both wings of the US establishment share the same historical and moral DNA, and what they represent is premised on white supremacist imperialism and authoritarianism. And to be honest, I think that's a strong argument, and it certainly has to be reckoned with. And the context is important. So both parties, part of the way that this is continued is that both parties are built on the same mythology and propaganda. And I think it's worth pondering on some cultural examples that lend weight to this. For example, the highest grossing film of all time, Avengers Endgame, one of the central characters in this is, of course, called Captain America. Now, I always think it's a useful thought experiment for anyone listening and watching to imagine if the highest grossing film of all time had a Captain China or a Captain Russia, Captain Iran, Captain Palestine, any of those things as its central character, it would be for many people galling, but certainly stark. And so I think it's important for us to understand the levels of propaganda and indoctrination. And the West, although it doesn't refer to it as such, the US has the largest prison labor camp system in the world, accounting for 25% of the world's prison population. And so I think these things are important for the overall context in the sense that they're features and not flaws of the US system. Now, to swing back around to Fiona's original point, there is more to it than that, in the sense that Trump does represent, support, and embolden a particular current of far-right forces, both domestically and globally. Some will be familiar with J.D. Vance, the vice president, who has certain, if we want to be diplomatic, conservative views on same-sex marriage, abortion, gun control. But these domestic policies have real-world impact on not just people in the US, but those beyond the borders. And it's worth pointing out that with regard to this as a global phenomenon and how the election of Trump helps to embolden these forces. In the UK, there is a very similar, I was going to say strain, currently embodied by Kemi Badenoch, an anti-woke yet Black woman of African descent who is infamous in some circles for downplaying racism and arguing that maternity pay is too excessive. Now, many people argued that these things should have already been case closed. These things should have been won, whether it's racism, maternity rights, abortion, etc. But history has a bad habit of returning. And this kind of, again, to describe it as neo-fascism without getting bogged down into the definitions, it's sort of come in the garb of culture wars, free speech, and this idea of taking back control that kind of exploits conditions of economic inequality and disenfranchisement. Now, whether you want to argue it's significantly different to what some people describe as liberal authoritarianism, such as in the case of pepper spraying students who are protesting against genocide, or similar, the bottom line is it's dangerous. And there are differentiating qualities when it comes to Trump and these far-right neo-fascistic forces. Again, as Fiona alluded to in the question, Trump has publicly supported armed white supremacists. One prominent example is Kyle Rittenhouse. And the scenes in Charlottesville that many people remember of fascists roaming the streets has a kind of normalizing impact where those ideas are legitimized in the highest office of state. Another thing, and this relates again back to Matthew's point about the electoral context, having a far-right president pushes the supposed political center further rightwards so that the whole discourse and choices become more right-wing. And just to say on Harris, it's an absolutely disastrous tactic, as has been shown, losing 13 million or thereabouts votes, trying to tack to the right, ignoring your base and trying to get elected on a ticket of patronizing your base and hoping for celebrity endorsements. I think the statistics bear that out. And also, it normalizes some of the extreme right-wing policies. The fact that Harris was willing, proudly and boldly to campaign on continuing building the wall to stop migrants from getting in is really an indictment of this point, and the fact that it's not just a disaster, although it is, of course, in terms of the direct human consequences, but the whole discourse and political spectrum is shifted to the right. Now, Biden and Obama, they both loved a good cage and deportation themselves, obviously in their case with a smile, but Trump has vowed to run the biggest deportation in US history. So if some of those vows, if some of those policies that they claim that they will pursue in office are enacted, it will, of course, be disastrous for minorities, whether Black, Native American, of East Asian descent, LGBT plus, and women, and so on. There is, I don't want to call it a silver lining, but there is something that can be taken from having someone like Trump in office. It forces the hand of so-called progressives to actually take some action. You'll remember in between 2016 and 20, there was a so-called resistance, but at least there was some coverage and rhetoric and discourse around progressive policies, certainly via the fact that there was a common enemy. And I think that can open up a space, again, come back to Matthew's point around building a third-party movement, but it has to be done in the right way, organizing principles, particularly in this context, which seems to be super polarized and as we refer to, with those significant obstacles which are distinct to the US. And it's also worth remarking that a lot of the rhetoric around the so-called war on woke and culture wars are effectively a distraction. When you get working class people blaming other working class people for the sins of the ruling class, you know you're being played, or you should know you're being played. And of course, Trump or any leader could be spending the money on far better things. In a country where at least 26,000 people die every year from lack of healthcare and 500,000 people are homeless, there's clearly many things that the US and leaders could be spending the money on. So on the kind of challenges side of things, it's undoubtedly going to be much more difficult for minorities. We'll talk, of course, about foreign policy as well, but there are some opportunities in there. One other point just to finish on really is there's also the dangers posed by Trump's relationship with other right-wing forces around the world. for example, Milei in Argentina, in Israel, which we will definitely come to, and others such as Modi in India. And I hope there's some time to be able to talk about this in the session today around Latin America, Venezuela, and Bolivia, because Trump, not just rhetorically, but materially supports a lot of these fascistic movements which have a direct threat to the stability of those countries. So there's no doubt to conclude that he is a threat to minorities domestically and will embolden some of those fascistic networks abroad. But there also can be within that some opportunity for real resistance, not liberal resistance.